welcome to this roundtable discussion on interrogating the United States stance and global leadership on the Israel, and we have added Palestine war. My name is Christopher Isike. I am the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States here at the University of Pretoria. ACSUS-UP, which is the abbreviation of Center, is a transdisciplinary platform that is dedicated to promoting U.S. literacy in Africa for the mutual benefit of both Africa and the United States, and to fostering, knowledge-driven engagement between African countries and the U.S. This roundtable discussion is in line with our mandate as it seeks to understand the U.S. stance on the current war in Gaza. I acknowledge the presence of the Deputy Dean, Research and Postgraduate Studies at the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Innocent Ikrai, who was the driver behind this event. He had wanted it to happen much more earlier, but we were involved in organizing a major conference and thought to hold it today. So thank you very much, Prof. Ikrai, for the idea, and thank you for coming. I also acknowledge representatives of the embassies here present, scholars, representatives of think tanks. I see Dr. Mabera from IDD, other subject matter experts from non-governmental organizations and academic institutions, and of course, precious university students that are here. I want to also formally thank our panelists for agreeing to speak at this ACSUS-UP roundtable. It promises to be a very engaging discussion, and we're looking forward to your contributions, which will make the discussion a rich one. I apologize that we are starting 10 minutes behind schedule. We had to wait for all our panelists to arrive. As you can see, one of them is still on her way, and as soon as she comes, she will be able to hopefully join us from wherever we would be on the program. Just a bit of the format of this discussion. I'm going to be opening the discussion by introducing the topic, and I'll do that shortly. I will also then introduce each of our speakers, and then they will each have 5 minutes, to present their initial remarks on the topic and offer or proffer some alternative but practical recommendations for resolving this crisis that's been kind of perennial. Now, the key question will be on the actions and inactions of the United States as a world leader at a time like this. Now, we are interested in knowing what are the global leadership gaps and what can countries of the global south do to fill these gaps, if at all there are any gaps that the United States has left in its leadership of this conflict or crisis or the war as it is. After their initial opening remarks, the next 40 minutes or so will be for question and answer within the table here, with me moderating that, and then the question and answer will shift to the audience, both here and those of us who are online for engagement with the panel. And this is the time where I also acknowledge those of you who are online to welcome you and thank you for your patience. Hopefully we'll try and finish before set time of 3:30. So in essence, I will manage the question and answer segment throughout the duration of this discussion, asking questions from the panelists, and then taking questions from those of you who are here and those who are online. And then at the end of the Q&A discussion, each of our panelists will be given 1 minute to close with a key message that they would like participants, both here and online, to take away from the discussion. So now to the substantive goal of this discussion. It is now common knowledge that on 7 October 2023, the military wing of Hamas launched a military operation on the Israeli city of Ashkelon, killing about 1,400 Israelis, with another 2,700 more wounded. And at least, by latest figures I saw yesterday, 222 others, including women and children, taken into captivity in Gaza. Now, Israel responded by declaring war on Hamas and mounted the siege of the Palestinian enclave of Gaza, which has been under the control of Hamas since 2007. Now, according to UN estimates and CNN reportage yesterday, over 5,000 people, including women, children, who make up 62% of this number, and another 23, including 23 journalists, 19 of who are Palestinians, 3 Israelis and 1 Lebanese, have been killed by Israel's retaliatory strikes on Gaza. The death toll also includes 28 medical staff. This is the figure as of last week. It could be more. I didn't get the recent figures as of today. But from the UN website, 35 UN staff have also been killed. They're included in these 5,000 plus that are dead from these strikes by retaliatory strike by Israel. And then over 15,000 people injured, with over 1 million Palestinians displaced. Now, the death toll and injury counts, the destruction, the humanitarian crisis continue to mount by the day, while Gaza remains under a total blockade with no access to electricity, food, and water. Now, we know that this war resulted from protracted historical tension, discontent, and obscurities surrounding the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And the UN Secretary General, António Guterres, has actually condemned Israel's siege of Gaza. But the US, a strong ally of Israel, has publicly declared support for Israel. Now, this initial stance by a world leader raises significant questions about its view of this conflict and its leadership or lack thereof on the war so far. Now, the broad goal here is to examine the Israel-Palestinian crisis and this war that is ongoing from a macro perspective and from one that is relevant to Africa. So in this regard, it is pertinent to place equal value on Israeli and Palestinian lives, properties, and rights. This is a critical component of UN conventions and must be considered a prerequisite for global peace and security. So, according to the UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, he says that for far too many, and I'm quoting him now, far too many lives, many of them children, have already been lost on both sides as a consequence of these hostilities. And unless something changes, coming days will see more civilians on the brink of death from continuing bombardment. Humanity, he says, must come first. Therefore, irrespective of the underlying currents of the ongoing war, interventions of global superpowers such as the US have the potential to assuage or aggravate the human factor and humanitarian aspects, as well as the eventual outcome of this war. Our goal is to interrogate the US stance and its leadership or lack thereof, like I said, on this crisis, with a view to exploring new standpoints and pathways for conflict transformation and sustainable peace building in the Middle East. That is our reason for having this discussion today. And we have on our panel 3, soon to be 3, but right now 2 speakers. And the order in which they will speak, they are Professor Anthony van Niekerk from the Thabo Mbeki School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pretoria. We also have Professor John Stremlau, Emeritus Professor, Department of International Relations at Leeds University. Our other panel who shall join us in the coming minutes, hopefully, Professor Joansi van Wyk, Research Professor, Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. I'm not sure that I have time to read all their bios. Maybe I should, especially for the 2 that are here, right? You don't? No. You don't also? No. Very modest people. But maybe they don't want you to know that one of them is an American, John Stremlau, and the other one is a high-profile institutional architect and experienced academic manager who does things for government at the SADC region, the African Union, and of course the government of South Africa. Maybe that's what they don't want you to know, but now you know. Colleagues, I'm going to kickstart this discussion.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm from UNISA, so the Thabo Mbeki African School, Public and International Affairs. So is Joansi van Wyk, Politics Department, UNISA. This is good for academics from different institutions to collaborate and work together. I really encourage that. We'll invite you back to UNISA when we do phase 2 of the beginning of a conversation, because clearly this is the beginning of a conflagration that with no end in sight. Remember when Ukraine started, some people said, no, 3 months, 2 weeks, they'll be exhausted, sanctions. Russians are weak, didn't you know? So, I foresee that this is an ongoing conversation. Opening remark, I think, is sort of how I see it. I started my speaking notes on the same in the same way as you did, Chris, by reflecting on the human toll. And by last night, I looked at Al Jazeera. I'm not sure about CNN these days. More than 5,000 Palestinians killed, 40% are children. And then the other statistics which you mentioned, the UN has people there on the ground, many of them killed as well. And I don't know about you, but you look at the videos and the scenes that emerge out of the rubble, and it must move you. Yeah. And so the question is, what do we do? And so here's my view. The United States, as it supports Israel in removing the threat of Hamas, views the conflict in the Middle East with the same eyes as it does Ukraine, Libya, or other places that has the potential to threaten its global position of dominance. The responses of the empire to challenges from the periphery has always been a securitized one. It is not difficult to see the military-industrial complex influencing American foreign policy choices, and in that sense, I have a profound cynical view that peace is not a preferred option until such time that profit from war becomes counterproductive. This plays out at a time when global order is reconfigured in front of our eyes. Ukraine and Gaza demonstrate what we can expect, which is the coming of a multipolar world, or maybe more realistically, Cold War 2.0, but turned hot, with contending blocs lining up behind the United States and the People's Republic of China, respectively. This is happening in the face of a crumbling system of global governance, with a divided United Nations Security Council, the most embarrassing illustration of the emerging Hobbesian world of anarchy, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You should know that quote. Where does it leave South Africa? Hobbes says anarchy is when the strong dominate the weak. South Africa is in no position to challenge the strong head on. It might want to draw on its remaining reserves of goodwill as a southern middle power to entice or join an alliance of the willing to explore peace. And in fact, at last week's Cairo Peace Summit, led by Arab leaders from Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar, and I was most impressed by the presentation by King Abdullah from Jordan, our President Ramaphosa articulated the South African government's position as follows. He made a whole presentation. I don't know if you heard it. I'll summarize it in 4 points. He said that the attacks on civilians in Israel, the ongoing siege of Gaza, and the decision to forcibly move the people of Gaza, together with the indiscriminate use of force through bombing, are violations of international law. South Africa calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, the release of hostages, the lifting of the siege of Gaza, opening of humanitarian corridors, and the urgent provision of humanitarian aid on the required scale to the people of Gaza. 3. South Africa calls on all state actors to desist from providing weapons to either of the sides to the conflict. And 4. Only through a UN-led negotiated settlement supported by the international community can the people of Israel achieve the security they seek and the people of Palestine realize the freedom they deserve. The ruling ANC, similarly, has a very clear position on the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. The ANC says it stands with the people of occupied Palestine as it believes that the degenerating security situation is directly linked to the unlawful Israeli occupation. It pledges solidarity with the Palestinians,
because the ANC believes they have a just struggle and their human rights are being violated, as well as their quest for self-determination. So, South Africa maintains two positions on the war on Gaza, where I frame it: a formal government position and a ruling party political position. The two are not inconsistent or contradictory, and probably useful if the expectation is that South Africa exercises some kind of influence in ending the conflict in the Middle East. In doing so, it should remain cautious not to antagonize the Americans or side with the powerful in this deepening conflict. It appears to me that both the Biden and Netanyahu governments are losing credibility amongst the international community with their insistence on a violent resolution of the conflict rather than pursuing peace. Worse, the drums of war might soon resonate throughout the region already tense with fear and loathing. South Africa should do what it did when faced with the Ukraine conflict: develop and advance a principled African and Global South position on peacemaking, peacekeeping, and post-conflict reconstruction and development for conflict situations in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. It has the added advantage of working within the BRICS alliance of like-minded states, which from 2024 will expand to include important regional leaders from the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. Drawing on its own experience of overcoming apartheid, South Africa's message to the global North and the global South should be nothing less than a negotiated settlement, supported by the international community, can give the people of Israel the security they seek and the people of Palestine the freedom they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. While Anthony was talking, our third panelist for the day, Professor Joansi Van Wyk, were walking. She was attending another event earlier on at UNISA. She's a research professor in international politics in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of South Africa. She has published widely on international relations, African politics, and South African foreign policy and diplomacy. She's co-editor of 4 volumes, co-editor for the forthcoming key issues in African diplomacy, development, and achievement. Welcome, Professor Van Wyk. Thank you for joining us. We were supposed to have 4 panelists. We were supposed to have Professor David Moyai, Director for the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg, but he just came back from China, picked up the flu. So, out of kindness and out of civic responsibility, he decided to stay away from us so that we don't get sick. So, we're only going to make do with the remaining of us. I just done the introduction before you came, so I would ask Professor Spindler now to give us his 5 minutes thoughts on remarks on the ongoing war in Gaza, and then we'll come to you.
I'm never quite sure whether I need this or not, but I'm glad to use it, and I'm glad that Anthony summarized very well the South African position that was articulated by President Ramaphosa in Cairo. And as you know, I have been a supporter of the South African position with regard to the conflict. There is a difference of view between Anthony and myself about the dynamics of international politics today. And I will be glad to take questions about the insanity going on in the United States. They can't even get a Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Donald Trump is a very viable candidate for the 2024 election. And I was interrupted by SABC just before coming in here. Could I comment that I said no? I'm going to be on a panel, but Donald Trump the front runner for the 2024 Republican nomination, sought to paint himself as a victim of political persecution, telling a crowd of supporters in Derry, New Hampshire, quote, "I don't mind being compared to Nelson Mandela." Can you believe? Can you believe? And I would say that a Mashatili Malema coalition here, which is not really very possible, and I'm an ANC member, but nevertheless, that would spell a very different foreign policy than South Africa has articulated via Cyril Ramaphosa in Cairo. And I would like to just briefly, and since I only have 5 minutes, give the attributes of the remarkable settlement here and see how that might be replicated in a peace process in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. And I just can't resist a historical note that when Bill Clinton was president, he almost pulled off a two-state solution, which Dennis Ross, my former boss, was very much a Middle East peace negotiator and has written a long book about it, Missing Peace. And it just didn't come off, but it was very close. The four attributes of the settlement here that I think is worth thinking about for the settlement there in the long term, not tomorrow. Leaders here were willing to take a risk for peace, a courage that has been missing in any of the factional, on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. Although Ehud Barak back in 2000, December 2000, did take the step to conceive of a two-state solution, which we thought at the time the Palestinians would agree to. The second attribute here was the willingness to take ownership. I remember when H.W. Bush offered to send Baker over here to negotiate, and both de Klerk and Mandela separately said to him, "No, thank you, we'll own this ourselves and we have to get on with it. Keep Baker at home." And that was, I think, a sign of ownership that is missing and those are the two big pieces. On the third aspect, whether or not you could have mediation, don't forget there was consensus about the wrongness of apartheid finally internationally, and it was everywhere, including in the United States. And Joe Biden took the lead in overriding the Reagan veto of the CAAA in '86. That consensus is worth bearing in mind now, because Cyril Ramaphosa and the South Africans have articulated repeatedly that this is an apartheid-like system. And I encountered a lot of Israelis who believed that the West Bank and the Gaza were apartheid-like going back into the 1980s. So that is at least one glimmer of a framework, of a vision. And the last and fourth item is a vision of the leaders of becoming survivors in a project that would allow for peace to prevail. And that has been missing so far, but I think the international community generally supports a two-state solution which would be fair to the Palestinians and fair to the Israelis. And I think the South Africans, by identifying with the Palestinians, give an impetus to the feeling that they would be represented in a peace process. And I alluded in my Daily Maverick to Cyril Ramaphosa's role in getting the Irish settlement, and that helped get it published because my editor was a friend of Ahtisaari's, and Ahtisaari and Ramaphosa played a critical role, but it was a minor role in the sense that it was critical, but it was only monitoring the agreement that the principles to the dispute had worked out for themselves. And somehow we've got to find the leadership, new leadership on the Palestinian side and new leadership on the Israeli side. But those people have got to do it themselves. And for characterizing the U.S. as a dominant power, I vote Democratic there, and I'm a member of the ANC here, and I pledge allegiance to the constitutions of both countries, but they're very different. And so I just think that that the fact that the Blinken and Biden or Blinken and Pendor and Ramaphosa and Biden can talk to each other regularly is a good sign, a positive sign. And if Donald Trump wins in 2024 and Mashatili and Malema prevail here, I'm heading for Mauritius.
Sure. Thank you very much. I was just watching you to tell you to be careful. We know people that have denounced citizenship for their passports in front of the world, and then they became stateless when the new states also rejected them at some point for criminal behavior. So we may end up booting you out of South Africa, and then the US may also boot you out and you become stateless.
Hey,
Yeah, so
I'm 80 years old, so I mean, what difference does it make?
I see your point. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Joansi, you want to tell us what your thoughts are?
Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say apologies. When your vice chancellor says she wants to quickly have a word with you, you know it's not quick, and you can't say no. So apologies. Chris, thank you for the invitation, and it was great to listen to António again, and great to see you, Prof. Stemlau. We still use your work, so AT is not a problem. Friends and colleagues, thank you so much. It's of course something that is at the top of our mind, and the media is running with this to such an extent that we have almost forgotten what's been happening in Ukraine. Besides that, what is happening in Africa? When last did you see an African conflict at the top of the news hour on, for that matter, Al Jazeera? Any of the news houses? We don't see that. So let's start there. Is that we have competing visions of what is happening in the international community. We do not know that what will be the effect of what's been happening in Ukraine and Gaza and Africa. We surely know that there will be resources diverted that could have been used for one or more major project on the continent. But more pertinent to our discussion for today, if we look at what's been happening in the Middle East, first of all, I'm going to do, with all due respect, a little bit of US bashing, and then I'll come back and say why we cannot look at the Middle East without the Americans. It's not a popular topic, but I want to be a little bit more polemical or controversial. If we look at what has been happening in Israel, we know that the US is at the back of Israel, and Biden has said it recently. There's a long history of having somebody of Jewish faith or origin within the White House. Blinken is, for example, from Jewish extraction. Kamala Harris, the vice president, husband is Jewish. So, Anthony, as you said this morning, personalities do matter.
Yeah.
I said not, but in a different context. So, we must be mindful that this long history, besides the Holocaust history, is that the US has been very present in what is now Israel, in the establishment thereof, but also in the Middle East. So needless to say that Arab Street, as is generally referred to the Middle East, is not happy. And we know that since the establishment of Israel, or at least when Israel called themselves independent in 48, and afterwards, the tensions in the in the Middle East has been growing. The temperatures consistently risen. So we see the Shah of Iran falling down, that revolution. We saw the events in Lebanon. We see in Iraq now in Israel. So that's the bad press of the US's involvement. Now, if we turn that around, we need to have a strong power that can at least have some sense, or at least somebody at the Security Council that can bring parties to the table. But does the US currently have that independent broker status? It does not. Simply because Gaza, Palestine, the West Bank clearly do not see the case. So we cannot wish the US away from the situation that has been unfolding. We can perhaps play to the legal argument by saying that this is an international humanitarian crisis. We can say that this is an absolute untenable situation. It is a crime against humanity, a crime of apartheid that cannot be tolerated. So the two-state solution needs to be sold again and again and again to the communities that is affected by it. So here we should have, at least by now, have some sense of civil society in both Israel and the international community and in the Palestinian territories. Where is civil society? Obviously, not as vibrant as we had in South Africa, for understandable reasons. So here I would then make the call that international civil society should become more involved. Now, if that is the case, we know that they will have difficulties in getting into Gaza and in the West Bank territories. We also know that it must be from state or states or organization that is acceptable by the General Palestinian Authority. And now, with so many world leaders being in Tel Aviv to meet with the Israeli president, the prime minister, etc., the honest brokers become way more scarce. So here is an opportunity for South Africa to, like First Premlau has said, is to play that active peace role. We have seen that our president, our government has consistently, in all the foreign policy conflicts or international conflicts, played the legal role, the importance of international humanitarian law, the importance of the seeking of peaceful resolutions. And I think this opportunity we should perhaps take it from our past and we should, and I suppose we still do, engage with our American relations and our diplomats. The fact is we have to work with what we have. We cannot say that the US does not have a role. It's too deep into that conflict. Hamas, of course, is not all Palestinians, but Hamas will also have to come to the table and say, you know, at one point in South Africa, the armed struggle was called off. So we need leaders like the caliber we had here that can make that step. Like you, negative in the sense that I don't think that Israel and Palestinian have at this stage those kind of leaders. Hence then my case that South Africa should become greatly involved if they will allow us. I'm not sure whether that is possible, but there is a case to be made for that. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Panelists, apparently there are similar but different views expressed. And I will start with the questions. So I've put the questions into two segments. One, just general questions around the nature of leadership or otherwise that the US has shown so far. But also then another segment on solutions, questions I'm going to be asking around solutions. So I'm going to be asking the panelists. We're going to have to talk to each other now. So the first question I want to start off with is why? I know that Anthony has already alluded to, securitization and the political economy of war as a factor or as two factors that make it impossible. But the question is really, I want us to talk. Why is it impossible to have a human-centered focus on the conflict rather than the histories, the bitterness, and all these arguments both for and against? but have not gotten us anywhere. Over the weekend, I was listening to an Israeli in Tel Aviv tell the government of Israel that they don't think that just bombarding and even killing Hamas, if they're able to identify who Hamas is and kill every one of them, would solve the problem, would make them live in peace, would make them not want to leave Israel and go find peace somewhere else. In other words, they are talking about some kind of political negotiated settlement. But my question, I guess, is why is it so difficult for us to use a macro lens, one of human beings, to look at this problem, to enable us understand that on both sides, human beings are dying. I condemn the violence perpetrated by Hamas, of course, in Israel, but I also, if I'm a leader, if I'm an academic, if I want to be objective, would also condemn the violence that has been meted out on people, women and children in Gaza, unless, of course, we are trying to imply that people, when they come from Gaza, when they are Palestinians, are not humans, and that they don't have the same rights and privileges that other humans in Israel have. So my question again is, why has it been impossible for the world, the United States especially, to focus on a human-centered outlook? I want to start with you, Anthony. Okay.
These are great questions, deserving much of our time. You're asking about the nature of humanity, which underlies two great theories in international relations, realism and its offshoots, and liberal internationalism and its offshoots. There's a school of thought that says, on the realist side, states, people, nations, governments realize that the world out there is anarchic, violent, dangerous. You have to look after yourself, protect yourself, build up the walls, arm yourself, find like-minded partners elsewhere, build alliances to protect what you have, and so on. There's another school of thought which we as South Africans intuitively grasped when we wrote our constitution and our foreign policy white paper on Ubuntu, which is the human security paradigm, which is also very different from the realist paradigm that says, but people can find each other, they can work together. There's goodness in people. You just have to locate that and build on it. We can create institutions. We can work together. We can cooperate. We don't have to compete. We don't have to see each other as enemies. There's a humanity that belongs to all of us, regardless of class, race, color, ethnicity. And that gave rise to the United Nations system. So some people believe that if you join the United Nations and the Security Council, there's a drive to promote, advance peace and security. The realists say, and when I look at this conflict that we're talking about now, Ukraine and Gaza, the dynamics there makes me a hard realist and an angry one too, because I see the powerful exploit the weaknesses of others. In fact, I think that I use world systems theory to understand what's going on here. There's an empire. To be an empire, to be a superpower, a world power, you have to have the tools to grab what you need to keep your economy going. It means you go to the Middle East and you take oil. Ask the Iraqis how that goes, or the people from Libya. But it's a declining empire, and when empires decline, they become edgy, nervous, challenged, fearful, and they see competitors as enemies. Ask the Americans what they think of the Chinese. China is a rising empire. It's okay now. We, as South Africans, we move towards the Chinese bloc, so to speak. There are two worlds competing, increasingly in coming years. There's the world of the OECD. You know what I mean by that. There's the global north. and they are desperately clinging to what they have, is the rising world of the G77 plus China. The first one has got the G7, the UN Security Council, Davos. What do you think happens at Davos? The others from the global south have the G77, BRICS, and now BRICS Plus. Do you think these two worlds will coexist easily? I see competition, and I see violent competition, which is why Biden goes to Israel and say to Netanyahu, who's a reprehensible politician himself, I'm here for you. I'm standing on your side. I will give you what you need to eliminate Hamas. He's talking war. Biden is talking war. The Americans are talking war. I've not heard American diplomats, there's one in the room, or leaders say, what is the path to peace? Cyril Ramaphosa at the Cairo Peace Summit said, here is a possible path to peace. I heard him say that. I'm on that side. And so for me, on balance, liberal internationalism, the idea of working together for the common good is what we want, is what we strive for. It's what we need, is to overcome this thing that you talk about. You put on the TV and you see videos and images of war and destruction. I don't think this is where we want to be. But the realist in me, and in the American, and in the European, and probably in some of the Arab states as well, I don't underestimate Iran's search or quest for regional hegemony. Also makes me realize this thing of a happy family is not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and I'm not going to expect you to answer me now. I'll just ask a question that you think about before I go to the panel. I agree that realism is real. It's a thing, right? But at the same time, world leadership theory tells us that no world power in history has been able to maintain their world leadership through the use of force or hard power alone. They have often relied on what you call soft power to be able to maintain that hard power. And what that tells me is that, force alone cannot do it. Realism alone cannot do it. In the case of the United States, when they became a world leader after the Second World War, one of the soft power things they pushed forward, idea, innovation, as what world leadership theory calls it, was the idea of human rights, all right? The idea of democracy, the idea of liberalism, freedom to trade, freedom to move around and enjoy the benefits of the world. These are ideals that the United States stand for. These are ideals that the United States sought to preach to the world, to convert them, to enable followership. And these ideals have been what have made the United States maintain its leadership role in the world, not necessarily its power, its hard power, or its economy alone, because the United States understand that it cannot police the entire world. It needs friends, it needs allies, people who believe in its values. And 2 days ago, I heard President Biden talk about these same values. My question again is, why do these values not apply to some people? Why do they apply to only a particular kind of people? So I want to talk to you, John. What do you think?
I'm a simple guy. When I was born, there were 51 members of the United Nations. Now I'm close to 80, and there are 193. 193. These are not nations, they're states. They're states, they're sovereign states, they're equal states. They're equal in principle, but not in reality. As an American, we were conceived as a states' rights constitution. Our constitution looks more like a regional economic community in Africa than it does a human rights constitution that prevails in this country. This country has the greatest constitution in the world. It also, though, is the most unequal nation in the world. So how do you square inherent equality, which is the founding principle of the South African Constitution and the Freedom Charter, And by the way, what Lincoln was able to accomplish politically in the Gettysburg Address, he shifted. That's why it's called the Second American Revolution. And the comparison is really between Lincoln and Mandela, not between Trump and Mandela, as Trump would like you to believe. But it is a function of reconciling this paradox of state equality in formal sense. And Chris Kamani, the ambassador in Kenya, made that point very eloquently on February 22nd, 2022, when he was explaining the norms that prevail in Africa of taking the colonial frontiers and trying to build nations within them. Now, Israel was created as a European nation state, which was to say blood, or in this case, religion. So it's a theocratic state. It can't be a democracy in a full sense of the word as it's in the South African Constitution, because it's a theocracy. And so they were just like America was, and you know, Franklin Roosevelt is never held accountable for the fact that the New Deal didn't extend to black people, because the U.S. only had civil rights legislation in the 1960s, and we're still fighting the Black Lives Matter movement in the 2020s. Whereas South Africa went from a racist nationalism to a non-racial nationalism. But we know that the difficulties within the factions of the ANC right now. So these internal politics are played out in foreign policy and will be increasingly played out in foreign policy. Why? Because COVID doesn't respect frontiers, and climate change doesn't reflect frontiers. But until we evolve out of a state-based system, we're stuck with the United Nations. And so that's the answer to your question. Is we've got, in your generation, to move beyond sovereign equality. But everybody pleads sovereign equality, including little Benin. And it's sovereign equal to the U.S. You know, Bibi Netanyahu, it represents a sovereign nation. It's a very diverse nation, and he's a minority and a right-wing leader, but he's got to be overthrown by the people of Israel. And anything you can do to encourage that is great, including making the two-state solution, which is contrary to what I would prefer. I prefer to see a one-state with Arabs and Jews living side by side like they do in New York City. The second largest population of Jews in the world is in New York City. Go figure. There are 40 million African Americans in the U.S. It's bigger than and they're all Democrats by and large, with some glaring exceptions like Franklin Thomas. But why isn't South Africa? Well, it is. It's playing to Biden, and the Democrats have to stay in power in the U.S. right now because the Republicans have been taken over by the Trumpists.
John, you have to be using the mic when you talk. Because you are not just talking to people in the room. Those online can't hear you when you don't use the mic.
Well, I was projecting.
Yeah, so as Commander-in-Chief of this panel, hitting to you that you must use the mic.
Human rights.
Well, that's part of the problem, isn't it? Joansi, what are your thoughts on this? And then the next question I would like us to move on straight to is to examine the leadership that the US has, provided so far. Leadership or non-leadership? Or just a minute or two on this particular question.
When we speak about human security, there's something fundamentally wrong in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. There is what can I call it? There is a culture, a history of using humans as shields, as suicide bombers, as making them exceptional, as Jews, as special, etc. So I think there is an existential issue that first needs to be addressed if we can move forward. As long as you can throw people and children as human shields, then you can't claim human security, in my view. So it is important that we understand that each of these cultures, whether it's Palestinian or Israel, there must also be within themselves a fundamental shift. Now, what does that shift entail? How democratic is Israel? How democratic is the Palestinian setup? So what we see is that in the Gaza side, well, Hamas side, Al-Fatah, it's not as rosy and as democratic as we would like to believe. And Anthony has referred to Netanyahu, who is not lily white. He has a reputation, well, most probably court cases against him for corrupt dealings in politics. So I think that is a place where we as South Africans can perhaps start, is first get the house in order. Make human rights above all important by recognizing human bodies not as sacrificial entities, but as entities that should be protected. Then, moving on, if I may quickly, can I return to the US, for example? In my view, the US should be present in the Middle East as a counterforce. I don't know what that presence should be like, but at least we know that politics in the Middle East is sometimes, well, as we've seen, it is, let me rephrase it. It requires some sort of external arbiter. And we know that the UN is not that arbiter. I'm not saying the US is that arbiter, but we need an extra or a third or a fourth party that can play that role. And who that can be is, I would make the case again, South Africa, even the African Union. Egypt is involved in this crisis, and we cannot deny that. So we can perhaps also capitalize on Egypt's dual identity, that it can play a role and perhaps open a door for
It sounds like this. What should we have expected from the US? Have they acted any different from how they have acted in the past in terms of, showing support to Israel? I do recall that the spokesperson for the Israel Defense Force said in the first 4 days after the conflict that they did not need American blood to fight their war against Hamas. They did not need any kind of military support. This was even after Biden had pledged that support. And despite that comment, the support kept on going. And it feeds into Anthony's comment that Biden was speaking war. And so it makes me want to ask the question, has the United States shown the world leadership in line with the innovation of human rights, human security, peaceful world, global security, wanting everybody to key into that, and the US as a front runner? Has the US actions or inactions in this conflict, in this war, shown leadership? You want to start, Anthony?
Let me make some general remarks about leadership. And let me be provocative back to your auntie. The Middle East needs America as much as Africa needs America and its military might. Let me start by saying that America is a superpower. As a small country, we can't ignore. You have to find the way to live with the elephant. AGOA is not a small thing. Our trade relations, diplomatic relations, these things are important. But where the Americans go with their army, they cause chaos. Ask anybody from West Africa or from Nigeria. when you invite the Americans in to fight violent extremists. You enlarge the problem, you don't solve it. So what the Americans do with that militarized way of thinking, of protecting the empire, they do in the Middle East. In that sense, Israel is a military outpost of America. I don't know about how independent Israel is. We could even be more controversial and ask, does it have access to nuclear weapons? Where does that come from? I'm speaking as a South African. We had nuclear weapons in the 1980s. The apartheid government, they didn't make these things themselves here in Pretoria. They stored them here underneath the University of Pretoria, these tunnels here. It was made by the partners they chose. Whether apartheid was repugnant or not, there was collaboration between the West and the apartheid regime to produce nuclear weapons. This is not a good thing. And it continues. We don't want that. The second point is, I wonder about you, but I'm skeptical about the political class, whether here or in Africa or in the West or in America. I've seen some surveys that suggest that that citizens lose their faith or their belief in politicians to do the right thing. There's quite a sort of a serious decline in popularity of politicians. I'm also sort of feeling the same thing, because when I looked, let me contradict myself. Earlier I said there was the Cairo peace process. President Ramaphosa was there, he said the right things, and I think, and I support that. But at that summit, did you see the TV pictures of the room in Cairo? Like a mini UN Security Council thing with lots of shiny sort of chairs and so on. People were sitting there in 3 rows. Politicians, leaders, princes, and presidents, and then their national security advisors, and then probably the runners, the ice boys. The citizen, you and me, were not there. Those people spoke on our behalf. The Cairo Peace Summit didn't conclude with a statement of intent, because the politicians used the moment to put their own position forward. That's why sometimes I think realism really works for me. They couldn't see through the need for a collaborative and collective effort. I'm increasingly convinced that if humanity is faced with a disaster such as now in Gaza, or in 3 years' time, an American coalition invades Taiwan to protect it from China, and China retaliates, and there's a regional conflagration in the South China Sea, then do we want politicians to solve the problem? I'm increasingly thinking that citizens have agency and power to make their voices heard. Why can't we have every Nobel Peace Prize winner so far write a letter to the very same politicians who declare war in the Middle East against the one or the other side, to say we want peace? In fact, and then my last point, how do we give effect to this urge that I have for us to overcome the shallowness, the short-termism, and the egoism of politicians who look after themselves all the time? Remember how we fought apartheid. One element of it was to create and sustain a global and international anti-apartheid movement. And people rose up and created the conditions for the politicians to move forward with decisions. This is now what I think Palestine needs. I also see on the TV screens, not only, babies dying in the rubble. I also see hundreds and thousands and millions of citizens walking the streets of capitals in the global north and the south, asking for justice. And that's, if Tim Muriti was here to talk to us, he would have made this point about pursuing justice. And so for me, the leadership is failing. The political class is failing us everywhere. And it creates the opportunity for other voices to come through. I don't know if I'm too idealist when I say this, because I'm a realist.
Well,
There's a contradiction.
Well, maybe not. Maybe not. Digitalization has enabled citizenship diplomacy and agency in many ways. We also even saw people of Jewish descent in the United States go to Capitol Hill and protest right there that what is happening in Gaza is not in the name of Jewish people. So these are important footprints, and as more people are becoming aware of what is happening and making decisions themselves, and as we digitalize politics more, hopefully these voices can, become a movement of some sort to help. You asked a question earlier of whether Israel as a state is autonomous or independent, but we could also ask the same of the United States. If you look at the enormous power that the Jewish community in the US has, the influence that they have on not just the government but on politics in the United States generally. It's a question to think about. Okay, we don't have much time, but I think that we generally agree that we've not seen much of leadership. John?
I just want to say a couple of words. One is that Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, said, he wanted to stay a historian so he could predict events after they happened. And diplomacy is all about keeping things confidential so that you can experiment with ideas. And we don't know what Joe Biden said privately to Bibi Netanyahu, because we think that, I think that he was trying to discourage a push for military into that terribly overcrowded and humanitarian disaster, which is the Gaza, even though they want revenge. And he tried to identify with the 9/11 overreaction that the United States did by going into Iraq. And Thabo Mbeki warned Bush Jr. about going into Iraq because there were no weapons of mass destruction, and South Africans knew that. But nevertheless, Bush had a majority, and don't forget, we're talking about democracies here. We're talking about having a free discussion among ourselves about what's going on in the world. But Biden has to reconcile all these different factions and get himself reelected. The U.S. is not a reliable partner right now because the Republican Party is dysfunctional. When I was growing up, we had real stability because there was a Cold War, and people were willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the party in power. And to say that it would represent the national interest, whatever that was in regard to the Cold War. It's now much more chaotic. And so therefore, we really don't know what Biden and what Ramaphosa say to each other, because that's privileged. And that's just the way it is, guys.
Right. Johansi, quickly, just a minute.
Thank you. One last thing that I would like to mention is that schijnheilig, what is that in English? Yeah, there's another word. Hypocritical. We must remember that there's a lot of hypocrisy in the way that we respond to what's been happening now. If we had the same passion that we express in this case in terms of African conflicts, then our continent would have looked different. So for me, my plea is, let's first get our house in order so that we have that aspirations that we have for either Israel and or Palestine, that we get that realized at home. So let's do that self-reflection on where exactly are we. And I see that there are recordings made without permission. I'm not sure if that is allowed.
Recordings of this
Event.
It's not recorded, it's on Zoom.
There is a recording there.
Okay.
So I didn't give permission. I'm sure the other panelists did not. Besides that, I think that it is very important that we look at the role of the US. As much as we cannot wish Russia away from the Ukraine conflict, wish the US away from this crisis or from any other place. Superpowers, of course, history is a graveyard of empires. So what comes around goes around. But we must be mindful that the little guys, the citizens of the world, the citizens of countries, have that role to play. Active citizenship is so important. So, my takeaway, let's not be hypocritical of what is happening abroad and at home. Let's speak with the same passion about that conflict as we do with our African conflicts. Thank you.
Right, that's a very important information, because we've largely been critical in terms of how we see the conflict, which side to support, when to support. Sometimes we don't take different principles on the same kind of conflict, as we've seen. So far, we have seen that there are global leadership gaps. We talk about political trust being an issue. We can't trust our politicians, we can't trust our governance system, we can't trust leadership in states. And this is not just applicable to the United States. But you say it's also applicable to even the global south. I think that's what Joansi is also talking about in terms of failing to show leadership at home in our crisis. I mentioned that at another event that 2 weeks before the Ukrainian war, the Russian war in Ukraine, we saw there was war in Ethiopia. There was no mention. I didn't see any of the guys in CNN or Al Jazeera fly to Ethiopia to report from Ethiopia. But somehow, when the same thing, killing of people, of course, I'm not comparing both conflicts, but the common denominator here is that human beings were dying. That also implied that South Africa is maybe not so neutral and may not be able to play the same kind of role that it played in the peace, leading the peace envoy from Africa to both Russia and Ukraine in June. South Africa may not be able to play the same role, but there's a pathway for becoming a voice or a way to reach out, a leeway to reach out to Hamas. After all, our foreign affairs minister spoke to Hamas, right? So even though we may not be neutral, we remain a veritable pathway to helping to bring both sides together. But I want to talk about solutions because we're running out of time. One of the things that we have heard so far from our panelists are, one, that there's need for a negotiated settlement, right? And they talked about a two-state solution and the need for the US to be part of the solution, even though they are not an honest, neutral player. And that is also important for Hamas to come to the table. Those are the four points that we've raised. But the one question I would probably want Anthony to answer, because he raised that, is what exactly would a negotiated settlement be like? What exactly does that mean? One. Then two, I would ask John, you talked about the two-state solution. And my question would be, how fair and feasible will a two-state solution be without going to the 1947 borders, or at least the 1967 borders? All right, considering that Israel, between then and now, has eaten deeper and deeper into what was Palestine in 1947 or in 1967, and the entire territory is now occupied. So if you say two-state solution, what portion of that geography would belong to the Palestinians, and would they be allowed to control? Surely it will require that there's a redrawing of the borders. So that's the question I want you to try and answer. And then I think that Joansi has kind of started answering the question, but you can answer it some more in terms of why, even though you think that the US is not neutral, it still remains needed. Why not empower the United Nations, for example, to play that role? Why can't the US, and other powers, UN Security Council, be empowered to become a player in this conflict? Because we've not seen much of China, or Russia, apart from just vetoing decisions that are taken by sponsored by the US. So those are the three questions I want us to answer, and then I'll come back to the audience to ask their questions, and then we'll go to those that are online. So you want to start?
Yeah, I think that my dysfunctional stuff that you had.
Okay.
So, three quick points, because I think we need to hear the audience. It'll be fantastic. I just want to reflect very quickly back on the role of leadership, because as we spoke, I realized something else, which is be practical. Although I express my displeasure at the role of politicians, I heard this morning a diplomat say, Cyril is on speaking terms with Zelensky. They have a good relationship. They talk. Did you know that? Remember how the ANC government is criticized for, spending time with Russia, and then the American diplomat embarrassed us with a lady R, and that ship story. One of our own former politician, but now a member of civil society, Umzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, was appointed by the AU as on a panel of elders to go and mediate in a conflict which you refused to talk about for 6 months because it was traumatic, I think, for all of us. She went there. She has a story to tell. If you can invite her, she will explain to you, if you're a woman mediator in African politics, what happens to you? Do you know what happens to you in the room? If you get her at the right time, she will tell the story of how difficult it is. She broke through many doors and ceilings and whatever you say, and this is the way forward. In fact, there are NGOs, civil society can capacitate those who have the social skills to become mediators. And we can ask them to go and represent us. If politicians feel that they have to protect this and that interest, we can break through. The second point is, I think I know what the end state ought to be, which is security for the Israelis and freedom and justice for the Palestinians. It's not new, it's how we get there. So there's a short-term, medium, and a long-term sort of approach. The short-term is what everybody talks about now. When you switch on the radio or the TV, you will hear humanitarian aid corridors. It is so depressing to realize that civil society and the non-state sector and those who with means line up their humanitarian aid in trucks at the Rafah crossing. Hundreds of trucks. It looks like these coal trucks exporting our coal to China. Long lines. The Americans, which your auntie wants there, says to Netanyahu, keep the border closed because they might smuggle in stuff in one of these trucks to support Hamas. How do you know the bandages and the water here goes to citizens and the poor babies and it doesn't go to Hamas? How cynical can you be? This is where we are. So unfortunately, in this situation, when you look at António Guterres, I don't know, what do you see? When you hear him speak, what do you see? An old, defeated man. An old, defeated man. He was standing at that border crossing with the wind blowing his hair, which he couldn't control. And behind him were the closed doors. And he was saying into the cameras, please, can somebody open the gate? This is the Secretary General of the United Nations, which we have all agreed is the premier institution to promote peace and security. That is what has become the victim of a cynical game between superpowers and those who have power to exploit those who do not have. Whether we win this, I don't know, because if we don't, this short-term immediate support, if that doesn't work, I can guarantee you the conflict will escalate into the region. Hezbollah will wait. Iran will step in. You can mention other players. Ask yourself, where's Turkey? I think it's a dark horse. wants to be a mediator is not really brought into the picture. And then, again, I sound like I'm American bashing today. How many flotillas, is that what you call these groups of Navy ships? Striker group, there you see that military language, striker groups, have moved into the Mediterranean. In fact, they're parking in Cyprus. Cyprus is a holiday destination. It's full of soldiers now. See, there's the political economy of this as well. The Chinese are moving their own striker group closer. And so I see a much wider headache happening if we don't solve the immediate and short-term problems. And then my final point. Can't we break through this cynicism on all sides? I said here earlier when I read my last paragraph that I do believe that the BRICS Plus arrangement, so it's the original BRICS members plus those who are from the Middle East and North Africa, have the potential to move a negotiated settlement forward. Possibly, this is very tricky. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, South Africa, Russia, China, Brazil and Argentina are sort of on and India. And while India is hedging their bets, there's the potential of an alliance that can make a difference. The key question for you, Ansi, from me is how would the BRICS Plus arrangement deal with America? That's the big question. If they can make them a partner in a peace process, I'm for it.
Sure.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Anthony. John, on the two-state solution.
The environment so that you minimize the escalation risk and you address the humanitarian crisis that's going on right now. And I think those are the two main concerns, international concerns that Biden has. But if you're going to have a two-state solution, it's got to be owned by the principals involved, and they got to reach a consensus for what it is. My only other point is that Thabo Mbeki was a fabulous guy to teach African international relations when he was president here, because he was trying to structure an African Renaissance process and the African Union's new norms that would enable states to solve.
Just remind us of something. Anthony referred to Turkey. This crisis is for me still the dying days of the Ottoman Empire. This is now 100 plus years in the making, and we still feel the fallout of that Ottoman Empire. So let that sink in. So where do we then start to draw borders to get sovereignty recognized? So we sit in that part of the world with the same issue that we sit in Africa, but Ali Mazrui called the great transplant. States being imposed in certain areas in Africa, for example, or Middle East. So there is something fundamental about these events that we are seeing now. It will not change. Israel has committed to the Oslo Accords, Madrid, more recently the Abraham Accords. So what we effectively see is that those agreements that have been reached obviously is in the balance. So what we do see is interesting actors coming to the fore. Qatar is a very important broker who has been involved in some of the negotiations already. Individuals, I think it is Future Forward is one of the organizations, a consultancy in the UK, that is also involved in the process of the negotiations on hostages that to free that. The UN clearly is not going to make its way. Veto is still too strong. So what does that leave us? Well, the Chinese and the Russians, where are they? So here we have two members of the Security Council, permanent members, that are missing in action. That to me is worrying. Then remember, as Anthony said, that for China, this case is very important for its realization of the Belt and Road Initiative. It wants to get to Africa, it wants to get to Europe. The Middle East is one of those places that you have to cross. So, what is the game there? What I'm trying to say is we are seeing big geopolitical shifts which are not new, but are now in a position where we see some serious changes to make. Finally, the US. Clearly, the US is not an honest broker. It is perceived as not an honest broker. The US goes to Saudi Arabia. They go to Israel. They go to, all other places in the Middle East. Israel see it as an honest broker. As I said, you cannot diminish the US from that reality, whether we like it or not. So that is a reality that must be taken into account. Let's focus on the positives. That there are voices going up in the international community that this is clearly not on. And I want to state here that it's not acceptable for the kind of destruction and death that are occurring on any side, Africa, wherever. So what we are seeing is that private brokers are coming to the fore. The individuals from Future Forward as well as Qatar. And remember, Qatar was just the other day, it was enemy number one in that area. So Qatar is also building itself and rehabilitating itself in the Middle East, which is also another interesting issue. What I'm saying finally, Chairperson, is that this is a very complex issue. And I do not feel worthy to speak about these issues because I can only be somebody with an outsider's perspective. But it is good to hear different views, and it's good to get the emotions running because it means that we stand for something and we are not falling for everything.
I will now go to the online questions, some of which have been also here, and try to answer. But the one which we didn't answer, Anthony, was on the US vetoing the UN General Security Council resolution to have a humanitarian pause. And the argument that the United States had was that it would give Hamas time to reinvent itself and get itself back and arm them in so doing to prosecute the war. So it fits into the narrative you gave earlier on about the United States preparing for war or doing the war talk. That's what that question was about. And there's one of the online questions here asking why the US vetoed humanitarian aid or humanitarian pause to the conflict. And then I agree that the US opposing a humanitarian pause is questionable. And I'll add, at the same time, while opposing that, they were also supporting humanitarian aid to come to Gaza. They claim to have negotiated with the president of Egypt to allow that order to be open to allow this aid. But it is contradictory, it's hypocritical really, if they would oppose a humanitarian pause. Why would they oppose a humanitarian pause? So I see that as one of the gaps in leadership that the United States has failed to show in terms of this particular crisis. So that would be my response. I will now leave our panelists to try and respond. We'll start with Anthony, John, and then Joanne C.
I want to say that on the first, there's a couple of questions around a current world order, then there's a transition, then there's the emergence of new world order. I have a scheme in my head of how this is supposed to work, which a professor is meant to have, right? Just, but I think I need to I need to take a sabbatical and then work it out properly, and come back to your next meeting to tell you what I find or found, because it's profound. We live in an amazing period of time where we see how some commentators say the tectonic plates of the international order are shifting under our feet. Sounds good, right? What does it mean? Really. So I need to investigate that. The world of the OECD with a declining empire and the tensions that create. The world of the rising Chinese, the world of the G77 in China. and BRICS Plus. There are also tensions there and competition. How does that work? And then ultimately, maybe for Faith and me, in a separate conversation, what theoretical underpinnings do you need to make sense of this? Because if you can formulate in your head the lay of the land, you will have a tool to understand these fast-moving conflicts. If it's not in Ethiopia, then it's in the Middle East. If not the Middle East, it's in the Taiwan Strait. Is that the right word for it? And I can think of, if not Ukraine, then Belarus. And somebody raised the specter of nuclear conflagration. I remember Kennedy's role in dealing, and Khrushchev, and Castro. Personalities matter in defusing that nuclear crisis in 1962. I don't think we have the quality of leadership anymore to do that. In fact, citizens and the social media has become important players in international relations. And so in that scheme, we have to take account or give account for how they... When I was younger, I heard about a conflict here or there. For example, Renamo in Mozambique. It sounded very brutal. Today, I watch an unfolding war in Gaza and the West Bank in front of my eyes. I don't have to ask people to interpret for me how a bomb falls and kills people. I see it in live, real time. That is also altering the way that we have to teach international relations and understand it. So, and also as part of this transitional arrangement, I'm convinced, Johansi, that regions have leaders. South Africa is a regional leader. We lead in Southern Africa. We are weak at home, I know, but we also lead in a way. In the Middle East, Iran wants to be the leader, but there's also Saudi Arabia. There's no place for America there. America doesn't want others to lead, or they will lead if they can guide them, because the empire has interests in the Middle East, which it is protecting and using proxies to do that. I can't answer the UN vote question because I haven't studied the voting patterns on this particular issue. Maybe others have. Okay.
You know, nations are like people; they change, and we've seen enormous changes. Just think of South Africa before the transition here. Think of fascist Germany and the post-war settlement, and now it's a full-fledged democracy. Think of Japan. And yet we're at the stage right now where democracies are polarized internally. This country is no position to lead in Africa until it gets its own house in order. And the U.S. is also a questionable partner, given the fact that it can't even get a budget through the Congress, and it can't get assistance to Ukraine or to Israel, even if you debate whether or not that has merit or not. And yet, at the same time, we do have a Biden administration that's trying to moderate the escalation risk and therefore sees the real danger that was referred to in one of the questions about the balance of power changing. That's presumably, at least it makes common sense to me, why Hamas would act the way it did when it did, because it was the Palestinians were being forgotten, or at least so they could argue. And in a sense, no one really wants the Palestinians, and so they've got to have their own state. But that's my view, not debatable. I mean, it's debatable. The failure of democracies to get their acts together and get authorities that are viable and it is a problem for all of us, for Americans and for South Africans and for any democracy that is narrowly divided and doesn't have a commanding majority. The alternative is a dictatorship. like Putin or Xi Jinping. But those countries are very much in the 19th century mode.
Thank you. I'll be quick. We talked about leadership. Who elects leaders? It's you and I. So, as much as it is a reflection on leadership, it's also a reflection on humanity and the way that we see ourselves, our fellow man or woman, and of course, what is it to be human? So it's once again that hypocrisy that I spoke of is when we want to hold leaders account, it's in effect having to hold us as humans or as voters to account. That's the one thing. Secondly, Henry Kissinger, who turned 100 years this year, said that countries do not have friends, they have interests. And here we see basically what is happening is that this is about raw interests. So whoever comes along and helps a state's interest is a friend. So this is sadly a situation in the Middle East that has been going on for a long time. We see that elsewhere also. And this brings me to the question on hegemony. Now, was it Gramsci that coined the term hegemony? He said that the old has not died, the new is not born, and we sit in this middle interregnum. I think we are there at this stage, is that something is happening and we don't see the plates moving or hear the plates moving. Well, I suppose we do see that, but we are entering an era which is not unique because international politics is a very dynamic field, but something is surely in the wind. Now, coming back to Hamas, I think if I was a military strategist, I would have said this is a brilliant attack that they have launched. If you were interested in that, they ticked all the boxes. And one cannot deny that. But that indicates to me that war is changing. Asymmetrical warfare will remain part of our future landscape as much as the type of war that we see in the Middle East. On human shields, allow me to clarify that I don't even know what is nonsensical. I don't know what that means. Sorry. It doesn't sound good anyway. So let me talk about human shields. As much as I refer to human shields, the point I was making, it was in the context of humanity and human security. And let's not forget that in South Africa itself, we used child soldiers in the apartheid era. Children were called up at age 16, minors, and they were put on a call-up for the Defence Force. On the other side, youngsters were also used in the struggles. The point I'm trying to make is we cannot weaponize bodies. And clearly, on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, bodies are used for a specific political purpose. And this is what Mahmoud Mamdani said, is the necropolitical nature of humanity and its state of affairs. Is that once we are so much in love with our interests that the body and death becomes the tool, then what remains? And this may be a question that we need to take forward, is that all lives matter, irrespective of where they are. And we see that lives have been lost, but also we've lost truth in this conflict.
All right, thank you very much. Let me, there are so many comments, but I'll just read one that kind of captures the sentiments I've seen from the different comments. It says, "It long, why entrust the US with any power to make decisions on peace and human flourishing when they clearly only serve their own ideological and political interests? This record is littered with their blatant disregard for human life. Why entertain this portrayal of them as superpower that will now suddenly act humanely towards their fellow humans when their very status as a so-called superpower is founded on genocide, exploitation, subjugation, and a militarized force? Why would they now characteristically act ethically towards the oppressed people of Palestine when they and their British cooperative gave the land to the Israelis without the consent of the Palestinian people. To frame the existing situation as something more nuanced or complicated than a matter of historical injustice perpetrated against Palestine is mischievous. It is as simple as life and death, sovereignty and the promotion of human life. Legal arguments are empty when the US dictated legal terms. Yeah, aid. So that comment, most of the strands of that comment is reflected in the other comments that I made, so I will not read the others. But to the question, one of them okay, there's one here from Taiwo that clearly that says he disagrees. The US is providing leadership. He believes that they are actually taking sides. The open support for Israel is well-documented policy. Palestine need equal access to social justice and deserve statehood of their own. America should be above board. So those two comments frame what our thinking has been. But the questions are, what is the logic? What is the logic behind Israel carpet bombing Gaza, right? Then two, Hamas is not in control of the West Bank. Why were the people of West Bank bombed, right? Three, I think we've already answered this, and then the one of Victor we've already answered. And then there's a question there on why did the West choose to be silent despite Israel's obsession with illogical expansionism. So those are the questions that have been put forward from those that are online. Those are the ones that I've received. The rest are mostly comments. How do you respond? We have about 5 minutes, 1 minute each for you to respond, and then we'll do our closing statements. Anthony?
Yeah, out of all of this, let me focus on carpet bombing, so-called. I think the logic is to drive the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip south, to prepare for the ground invasion, which is meant to eliminate Hamas, destroy pens. That seems to be the logic. The reality for me is 2 million people in a small piece of land. You throw how many bombs now? 6,000? Who's counting? Bombs, buildings collapsing, families trapped, and everything else. It defies logic. So I can't. And I think what is happening, this war crime that one day will serve at the ICC, will give us better insight into the thinking of the generals and the politicians who work together to execute this plan with the eager assistance of others from the West.
John?
There's an old saying in international relations that you don't have permanent friends, only permanent interests. But permanent interests presume that you have leaders who reflect that permanent interests. But in fact, what we're seeing now is a rapid change of countries and relationships that require enlightened leadership, and democracies need to stick together. And I think that the fact that the South Africans and the Americans can continue to talk about solutions in the Middle East is a good positive sign that ought to be encouraged by all of us. And the fact that the Israelis are stuck in a theocratic model of their nation state is a function of the anti-Semitism that is part of America's sins of the past, just as it was in slavery. So nations change, and we've got to stay abreast of it. And I think this discussion is constructive in that regard.
Thank you. Let me start on constructivism or constructivists talk about the logic of appropriateness, the logic of consequence, and the logic of proportion. Now, being a variant of realism, I find that interesting to look at this case. So, has the events been appropriate? I suppose one can say yes. depending on your view of the historical trauma on all sides. Has it been in proportion? I mean, you can't take a national defense force against a non-state or a state actor. I mean, that's not a fair game to play. And the logic of consequence. I mean, did Israel really think that this will have no consequences at all? I mean, you just repeat the trauma that you say that you are going to overcome, etc. So what we need to remember here is that international law, in my view, should be sacrosanct. And there has been...
I had to ask some of the questions for your information that people wanted to ask. You didn't have so many questions because I already asked those questions. I actually helped you. But let's close it now. Let's close it now. There was a question I think that was not well answered. I don't know, the one about it asks about the timing by Hamas. Whether it was designed, the attacks now was designed to cause the rapprochement that was already taking place between Israel and many of the Gulf states. And we're already seeing that some of them are kind of pausing, maybe rethinking. We don't know for sure, but that's a very important question. But let me close this now by saying that I do not believe that states can be equal. We can compare the United States, for example, with Mali, with Togo, with Slovenia, for example. But human beings all over the world have a basic level of equality which needs to be put on the table. And that would mean seeing people rather than objects. That would mean seeing people rather than histories. Rather than arguments, rather than interests, whatever that may be, right? And if we see people, then we can now begin to talk about, what type of people are more suited to peace, what type of people will bring a different coloration to age-long challenges around peace and state-making and collective security. And that would mean that's where the opportunity for feminizing the peace process, that someone suggested, would come in, would give us an opportunity to see new actors, private brokers, as Joansi has said. And as John also said, in international relations, there's the concept of no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, but permanent interests, right? Can the world articulate a common interest based on one ontological view of people as humans, and that we have a common interest that can become the basis of viewing and resolving perennial and protracted conflicts like the one we have just discussed. I don't want to be like any judge. I don't want to be like anyone on CNN, but this is where we close, and thank you all for coming.